Success Insight shares the stories of the people with passion and drive who make things happen in the world. Here's your host, Howard Fox.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of the Success Insight podcast. Our guests today are Rebecca Boggs Roberts and Lucinda Robb. With the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment and with the election here in the U.S. now nearly 2 weeks behind us, and our nation set to swear in its first female and woman of color vice president, the Suffragist Playbook, Your Guide to Changing the World, by authors Rebecca Roberts and Lucinda Robb, fittingly takes its place alongside what will now be remembered as an historic election day for women. The book is both a practical guide to becoming a change maker and a look at the struggle for women's rights, written as a tribute to their mothers and grandmothers. Rebecca and Lucinda, welcome to the Success Insight podcast.
Thanks for having us.
Fantastic. Just thinking about the historical significance of the Suffragist Playbook. I mean, we are just now celebrating the 100th anniversary, or just past, which was back in, was August
2026. August 26th.
August 26th, 1920. And here we are, 100th anniversary, and now we have our first elect female and woman of color vice president. You both timed this book. It was unbelievable. How'd you do that?
We're really, really clever. We absolutely did it on purpose.
Fantastic.
No, we hoped to time the book to the centennial of the amendment, as you said, and then COVID happened and things got delayed. But we got lucky in a couple of ways, not just with the historic nomination of election of Kamala Harris, but also one of the goals of our book is to help young people feel like they can change the world, that they can become activists themselves. And this summer, throughout all of the protests against police brutality and race equity, there have just been so many strong, vocal young people that we, don't need to convince them anymore they can be activists. They know it for themselves. So it's been good timing on a lot of fronts.
That actually brings up a question. Is the young lady and the gentleman from Florida, they were a part of the school shooting, and they became extremely active on Twitter, and just the energy they brought to this whole election cycle and getting young kids out to vote. How does that type of energy, how did it translate into what you both put into the book? Now, before you answer that question, I wonder if you could also share, how did you two meet and come together and decide, hey, let's write this book? So let's first start there if we could. Lucinda, why don't you kick it off for us?
Well, Beck and I, our families have been friends literally for generations. Her grandmother and my grandmother were both political wives together in Washington, D.C., and both from the South. And they would go around and do all of the things that you did when you were the wife of an elected official in sort of Washington, D.C. And they got to know each other that way. And it sort of started a lifelong and generation-long friendship. Becca's mother, Cokie Roberts, and my mother, Linda Robb, wound up being friends. And as it just so happens, Becca and I are now doing this book together. There's a funny story that I recently was reminded of. Somebody said, well, when did you first get to know each other, and how long do your families go back? When I was born, my mother gave birth to me. Just a few days earlier, Cokie had Becca's older brother, Lee. And so she had Lee send me a telegraph saying, I've been waiting all of my life for you. So there's always been this joke in my family that we've been promised and we were going to wind up eventually getting married. And as it happened, we found our own spouses, and I think everything worked out for the best. But it really does go back for a long time. Now, this is the first time we've had any sort of, in our families, any publishing ventures together. But it is very nice to feel that we're continuing this relationship and friendship for another round. And it's been great working with Becca. We've had a lot of laughs. We've definitely matched up well together. I think I'm sort of someone who really looks to the 19th century and the suffrage movement, and Becca's expertise is in the 20th century of the suffrage movement. And our personalities have worked really well. Becca likes to joke that she never met a first draft she didn't like. And if it was up to me, we would still be editing this book. So we sort of balance and play off each other pretty well. But it's probably been one of my favorite things about this entire experience is really getting to do something like this with someone that I enjoy and trust and respect so much.
Very nice.
Oh, thanks, Lucinda. I totally agree. And actually, what's great is not only the idea that our mothers and grandmothers were friends, but as I think about it more, as we talk about the value of women's power, which often gets overlooked in the sort of Hall of Fame classic model of American history, because the only people who qualify for the Hall of Fame are people who held important offices or had a lot of money. And by definition, that leaves women out. And so you really have to broaden your definition of power and influence to make sure that you recognize what women could do. And our grandmothers worked together for all intents and purposes. They might have been political spouses, but Lady Bird Johnson and Lindy Boggs were formidable, powerful women doing it their own way in the role that they were circumscribed to in the 1940s and 50s of Washington. And so not only is this friendship now on its third generation, but actually they've worked together and made a difference together. And that's a legacy that I think Lucinda and I both take pretty seriously.
That's fantastic. And I have to say, this is the proverbial growing up in the neighborhood where all the families knew each other and entertained with each other and took vacations and got to know each other. And it's just some of the best times, and extends, in your case, over 3 generations now. With the background that you both have, how has that informed your careers and what you have come to think about? One of you is very interested in the 19th century suffragist movement, the other, the 20th century. How has this background, this legacy of political activism, getting involved in the community, how has that informed what your thoughts are on the importance of the suffragist movement?
I think that one thing that really stands out to me is because we both come from a very public world, the way that we look at the suffrage movement is not strictly from a historical perspective, but what are the tactics? What are the strategies they're using? I think that's always sort of back of mind because that's the way that we grew up, having a front row and so many different political movements. And just that was the sort of thing that we talked about. That was the family business growing up. In my case, more politics, and Becca, politics and journalism. But we're always sort of thinking about, how do things play? How does this work out? What's practical and pragmatic? So it's not just sort of this happened on this date and this happened on this date and this was this person and then they died. That, a long list of a dry history. We really wanted to talk about why it was so relevant and why the things that the suffragists did. It was a long movement. It lasted, we talk about 3 generations. Well, the suffrage movement lasted 3 generations. It's usually talked about as being 72 years. You can argue that it was certainly longer than that. And in fact, when we talk about 1920, that's when the 19th Amendment was passed. But obviously, there were a lot of women who, practically speaking, were not able to vote until you had the civil rights movement that happened and the laws that changed in 1965. So we're always thinking about it sort of, what are the lessons? What are the things that they learned? How can we use it today? How can it become literally a guidebook to give us lessons so we know how to play our own hand? And I think that makes it a little bit what hopefully we were trying to bring that was sort of unique to the table in talking about this anniversary of the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment this year.
I think the other thing to remember about the suffrage movement is they won, right? I mean, it took a long time and it was really hard and they made some mistakes along the way. But they affected this massive and permanent change to American democracy without resorting to, armed rebellion. There are a lot of arguments for paying attention to women's history in the sense that you want all Americans to feel like they're reflected in history and you want to get it right and tell more than one story. But also, they were really good. They were really good at what they did. And they started from a position of absolutely no power and managed to change the Constitution forever. And so you could do a lot worse than looking to them for examples. And I think that both Lucinda and I, because we've grown up in political families, we are, as she said, practical. We're also patriots. We really care about this country. We care about the systems that make this country work. We are still believers in government and the legislative process. And the suffragists are really wonderful examples of how you can believe in your country and want to make it better at the same time.
So we've just had our election. and Kamala Harris is now the vice president-elect. As you alluded to early on, there was a lot of energy, especially from the young kids. And for the life of me, I can't remember the young girl or the little young man's name, the high school students. I can see them. But how do we take lessons from this movement, which, as you rightly said, it wasn't just, hey, flip of a switch and it's done. This took many years, and it took many more years for there to be a vice president-elect who is female and a woman of color. What are some of those fitting lessons that you believe we have learned, and how can we continue to keep those fires burning? Because we are, for the sake of better words, a divided country in a way. I mean, we have, 70 some million voted for President-elect Biden and Vice President-elect Kamala Harris, and another some million voted for the alternative. So how do we continue to affect the change and keep this fire burning from those lessons that were learned through the suffragist movement?
Well, it's funny that you mentioned Emma Gonzalez, because I actually was at the March for Our Lives and heard her speak. And for 15 years, I used to work for a company called The Teaching Company. And my job was to go around and grade college and university professors on their lecturing ability. And also, having grown up in politics, I've heard a lot of speeches. And I will remember the speech she gave for the rest of my life. It was one of the most extraordinary examples of someone commanding the stage that I have ever seen. And in part, she did it with silence. And I think, that's one of the first lessons that we talk about in our book is, telling your story and speaking up. And I don't know that people always realize how important that is in getting the ball rolling. I mean, nothing happens until you capture people's imaginations and you get out there and you tell a story. And back when the suffragists were doing this, we write about Lucy Stone back in the 1840s when she's speaking in public. This is considered wildly controversial for women to speak in public. In fact, women aren't even supposed to applaud in public. They're not supposed to make any noise. So this was a very radical thing that she was doing, getting up. First, she was speaking about the abolition of slavery, and then she winds up speaking about women's rights and eventually women's suffrage. And you have a whole bunch of women who sort of launched their careers talking about women's suffrage, because back then, going to hear people give speeches back before you had major sporting events and movie theaters and all the different ways we entertain ourselves today, that was what people did both for fun and to become educated. So you had this first round of suffragists who sometimes under very difficult conditions, they are roundly condemned from the pulpit. People go and they literally are heckling them and throwing things at them. And in fact, Susan B. Anthony is burned in effigy. And there's a lot of outright hostility, and the crowds can get pretty scary back then. There were two suffragists who spoke at the Philadelphia Convention Hall, and a big crowd came along, and they're actually speaking at the time about anti-slavery, and they burned it down the next day. So it wasn't an easy thing to do, but the suffragists were doing it and just getting your story out there. We still see it today. A lot of the things that the young people are doing, these are tactics that were originally pioneered by the suffragists themselves. A march on Washington. I'm going to let Becca talk about that because she tells such great stories about it. Or a lot of the things that people do, suffragists did it for the first time.
Yeah, once you start seeing the tactics that suffragists invented in contemporary activism, you kind of can't unsee it, right? So marching down Pennsylvania Avenue, it just happened last Saturday. No one had ever done it before the suffragists did it in 1913. There had been celebratory parades, but the idea of taking an issue to Washington, marching on Washington for a political cause, the suffragists invented that. Picketing the White House. I promise you, there is someone standing in front of the White House right this second with a sign. The suffragists invented that. And they did it right there on Woodrow Wilson's sidewalk to annoy him, right? To get in his face and get the press for that, and to do the 1917 equivalent of making a message go viral. when Mayor Bowser here in Washington authorized the painting of Black Lives Matter down 16th Street this summer, like she could have chosen another street. There are plenty of places to paint that. She chose 16th Street because it was in the president's face. It was an, intentional message to make him pay attention literally outside his window. So you start seeing all of these echoes. And I think another big lesson that activists can take from the movement is that it might feel like it's taking a really long time. You asked Howard about keeping momentum going. And you can look at the suffrage movement and say, man, from Seneca Falls to ratification of the 19th Amendment was 72 years. The original founding mothers of the movement didn't live to see it through. But with the lens of history, you can look back and see all the incremental change that happened in the meantime. And if you're only looking at the big goal, if you're only hoping for a federal constitutional amendment, which is really hard to do, which it should be, you miss that all along the way, women were getting more and more rights. They were getting to hang on to their own property and wages if they were married. They were getting divorce reform. They were getting reform in the age of consent. They were getting child custody laws changed. They were getting domestic violence laws changed. And little by little, over time, it became not shocking for women to vote. And so I think activists today can, in addition to all the tactics and sort of in-your-face activist strength that the suffrage movement had, it's really important to step back sometimes and realize what you've won, because sometimes it can be too easy to just focus on what you haven't won yet.
It's interesting is you are both sharing your thoughts, and I was curious about the breadcrumbs, and you just went and you answered that, because can you look in the rearview mirror and see where you've come from? And so what you're saying is very much those breadcrumbs are there. And you're right, we cannot make these large scale changes at the flip of a switch. Sometimes they take a while, but then we can gradually see the path that's been laid down prior, so that the new folks who are taking up the cause, whatever that cause might be, can have a path to move forward. And I absolutely love that. Let's talk a little bit more about the book now and its construction. Rebecca, why don't you kick us off and tell us about the book, the chapters, and I know it's not a long book, but it's definitely a book that is designed for young kids, perhaps high schools, teens, to consume and use. So start us off a little bit about the book.
We really wanted it to be practical. To both of us, that is the reason to learn history. It actually has relevant modern impact. It's not just knowledge for its own sake. And so each of the chapters is a lesson. And originally we kind of called them secrets, and then we realized they weren't really all that secret, but they're lessons that contemporary activists can take from the suffrage movement. And some of them are very broad and basic, like tell your story. Some of them are very specific, like pay attention to how things look, which is something the suffragists were masters at long before Instagram. And then there are things that turn out to be so much more relevant than we necessarily thought when we were writing the book. For instance, find the right allies. The suffragists, by definition, couldn't hold office or introduce legislation while female, right? They needed men to carry the ball that last couple of yards. So they needed to find the right allies who would work for a cause that was not self-motivated for them to make it happen. And how much conversation has gone on this summer in all of this introspection about systemic racism and police brutality and white people trying to rethink their less obvious racist attitudes and their assumptions about color in this country. And finding the right ally and being a good ally has suddenly really come to the fore as a vital part of any social movement. And so we set out a couple things that we thought would be really helpful, that we knew that all social activists really needed to master. We've also discovered that the ones that we thought probably rose to the fore weren't necessarily the ones, and that's going to keep changing. What we really hope for this book is that it's going to stay relevant because the advice in it is solid and useful, and that cause after cause can find a way to apply it.
Very good. Lucinda, what are your thoughts?
Well, it's funny. Becca mentioned the issue of allies, and that's something, particularly with the 100th anniversary, a lot of the things that were going to happen had to be curtailed because of the pandemic. So I wound up driving over to the Frederick Douglass house, which was closed, and standing outside and taking some pictures. But Frederick Douglass was one of the original great allies for women's rights from the very beginning. And in fact, we might not, for any of your listeners who don't know, traditionally, they have started the beginning of the suffrage movement in Seneca Falls in 1848, when a group of women, including Elizabeth Cady Stanton, meet together, about 300 people originally it was just supposed to be women, but a bunch of men showed up even back then, met in a church to talk about women's rights and have the very first women's rights convention. And they created a document they called the Declaration of Sentiments, which was based after the Declaration of Independence. And they had a number of different resolutions, and most of them passed without any question. It was a pretty progressive crowd, mostly Quakers and abolitionists. But there was one issue that was very controversial, and that was women voting. And it didn't look like it was going to pass until Frederick Douglass, who just happened to be there because one of his friends invited him to come, got up and said, having been enslaved, he knew how important it was to have political power. And his words wound up swaying the crowd. And that's the reason why we are able to have the notion that women's, right to vote starts in 1848, only because of Frederick Douglass. And Rebecca talked a little bit about how incredibly difficult it is to amend the Constitution. And it really is. It's kind of like doing 5 different Ironman triathlons in a row. I mean, it's just as hard as it gets. And by the time it had finally passed the House and the Senate, then it goes out to the states. They need to get 36 states to ratify them. And some states are jumping over themselves to be the first to get a ratification in. But it gets harder and harder. And eventually, it looks like it's coming down to the wire. A lot of the southern states have not passed it, specifically because they were against the idea of Black women voting. There was a lot of racism in the movement. And that is something that Becca and I also try to be honest about, both the flaws as well as the things that we think are good about it. But it finally comes down to the state of Tennessee, and it looks like it's going to fail. It's passed in the Senate, but it goes to the House, and they think they have the votes. The anti-suffragists think they have the votes to keep it from getting passed. And a young man stands up. He's only 24 years old. And they think he's going to be an anti-suffragist, and he winds up voting for it. His name is Harry Byrne. And when he comes out, this is the final vote. Everything is in sort of uproar. And the press asks him, why did you vote for suffrage? And he gives a whole bunch of different reasons. But the only one anyone pays any attention to is because his mother told him to do it. And every good boy knows that he should follow the advice of his mother. Now, I say this to my kids, and they're tired of hearing about this.
I have 3 sons. I want to embroider it on a pillow.
Oh yeah, but this is something, having those important allies is something that makes such a difference. And one of the advantages of having it take so long, and the way that they had to do it, is they had to persuade people. They couldn't just get it by force, as Becca says. And, we don't want to be doing things by force if we can help it. So they managed to peacefully persuade people. And that winds up really taking. I mean, one of the things you do see in the suffrage movement, it took a long time, but those changes are permanent. Even with everything happening today, you don't have anyone suggesting that we should go back and take women voting off the table. It's something that's widely accepted. And I think that's one of the aspects that I would say that is less focused on in the suffrage movement, but it's really worth looking at. How do you persuade people?
When you present the book or talk about the book, how do you introduce to these young kids the importance of these principles? I mean, we could talk about the history, we can give examples, but how do we persuade them that this is, I don't know, dare I say, the right thing to do? Whether you agree with it or not, it's the right thing to do. How do you begin that persuasive process using a book like this?
I got to tell you, Howard, I'm not sure we need to persuade them. I think that young people are willing to be active, and they see that they have a voice, and they see that they have a role. And it's certainly not take your medicine. This is a moral right, even if it's not very much fun. I think that You mentioned the activists who came out of the Parkland high school shootings, but also Greta Thunberg with her climate science activism, Malala Yousafzai with her rights for girls globally, her activism. There is example after example of young people standing up, even if they don't have the right to vote yet. And so I'm not sure that 50-something people like me and Lucinda need to be the ones convincing them they have a voice. Now, I think we do have a role to play in terms of convincing them that it's worth getting involved and that, every little bit matters and that they don't need to be a once-in-a-generation genius and they don't need to have $1 billion and they don't need to even be great public speakers. Every movement needs a whole lot of skills. And the suffrage movement is a good example of that. There were people who were good at a lot of different things and they each found their role. And I think especially right now with some of the issues that activists are taking on, climate change and systemic racism being the most recent and most obvious, those are huge problems. They feel really, really daunting. And that can be incredibly intimidating to think, man, I'm going to change the climate of the globe. I'm going to make a difference in a problem that entrenched and that hard to solve. But first of all, you don't need to take on a problem that big. You can take on a much smaller, more local problem. But you can also take on a tiny corner of a big problem, and it's still going to make an enormous difference. So I hope one of the lessons people take is just start somewhere.
Yeah, it's interesting, I can see now the word persuasion was probably not a good choice of words on my part, but I love the fact that we can have a conversation with kids, the Emmas, Malalas, the Gretas, and by the way, I love the last meme from Greta about certain individual going and just relaxing and go have a bowl of soup or something. I love the fact that, start local, look for a change that you can make in the community, look for something that is wrong or you perceive to be wrong and fix it and look for ways to get involved and try to fix it. If we're going to solve many of our huge issues, we have to start. I think it begins local.
Well, I would even jump in and defend the use of the word persuasion, because I think that one of the things that happens today is you find a lot of debate on, do you use radical tactics? Do you use moderate tactics? And sometimes you find different camps, people who are trying to get at the same goal, but in different ways. And people say, oh, you can't do it this way, you can't do it that way. And I think one of the real lessons for us from the suffrage movement is, to quote one of my favorites, Frances Willard, do everything. Don't limit yourself and think there's only one tactic or one way to get there. So I think you have young people who are very aware of protesting. I think it's definitely worth shining some light on the advantages of persuading people and how that works. And one of the things that really came home to me in doing this project is you need both your radicals and your moderates, and you had them in the suffrage movement. It's interesting, a lot of the women who started off as being seen as radical, by the end of their lives were considered, just practically, icons and beloved characters. Susan B. Anthony, in fact, a lot of the suffragists were very long-lived. Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and Sojourner Truth all lived to be 86 years old. I don't know what it is about that date, but when they started off, particularly somebody like Susan B. Anthony, she was considered, a firebrand, a radical. By the end of her life, she's getting invited to the White House. So you definitely have people filling different roles. But the advantages of having your radicals is that I think they move the goalposts. Your moderates are the ones who move the ball. And you really need to get all sorts of different kinds of activism out there. They don't necessarily work together. And in fact, in the suffrage movement, a lot of the radicals and the moderates didn't like each other at all. But they were successful together in ways that they might not have even recognized.
Fantastic. I'm curious for you both, given your backgrounds, the family ties and the politics, the journalism, your friendship, what is your take on hope? Do you have hope going forward using these models, these examples of, the many women and men who have been supporters of the suffragist movement and the strategies to affect change. What hope do you both have?
I actually have tremendous hope. I have 3 teenagers. Lucinda has kids in, early teens and teenagers, and I'm really impressed with them. They, not my kids specifically, but that generation. I mean, I'm impressed with my kids too, but I think that they are going to do amazing things because they're not willing to accept the world as it is. They think it's amazing that this is the first time that we've elected a female vice president. They think it's amazing that special interests continue to stand in the way of climate change. They think it's amazing that people are treated differently based on the color of their skin. And so they're not going to accept the world that we're leaving for them. They're going to change it. And so I am enormously optimistic about the next generation and what they're going to do to make the world better.
I think I have to agree with Rebecca. I come from Planet Optimism, and I do think it helps to be able to pull back and look at the big picture, the things that are so exhausting for us today. There is change that we're not able to see except through hindsight. That was one of the things that the first generation of suffragists did towards the end of their lives. They were having big events where they would have a speech on the 40 years of progress. We haven't got the vote yet, but this is all that we've done. And then 10 years later, they have to revamp it. It's the 50 years of progress. But one of them starts off talking about, how originally when she first started speaking, there were still ducking stools in New England. And now the fact that women can go to college and enter the professions. And, it's not just the legal changes that Rebecca mentioned earlier. It's what's accepted and understood that women can accomplish that has changed. And I think we'll see a lot of that same sort of the next generation, a lot of the problems that we have made and we're trying to address, not always successfully right now. Our kids are learning from us, and I think they will, in many ways, do better. And my biggest regret is that I want to live to be 150 to see it all, and that's not going to happen.
I'm curious, and again, you both have done an incredible amount of research and just to help prepare for this book. And you also have, again, the hindsight of your backgrounds with the family and politics and in journalism. Looking back to some of the early suffragists, Katie Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, and I would be remiss if I didn't call out for my podcast guest earlier in the year, John Holliday, whose relative was Clara Colby. What do you think they would say today, what they're seeing, especially now we have a vice president-elect soon to be a vice president? What do you think they might say?
I mean, I think they'd probably say, what took you so damn long? I also think that, because some of them were running for president in the 1880s. I also think that they would look around and see women being professionally successful, being socially, out there in the public sphere in a way that was unfathomable to them. They'd be impressed. I think that we have done their legacy pretty righteous when I look back. Now, I'm not saying things are perfect. There's certainly plenty of feminism left to be done, but I think they'd be pretty proud of us.
Very good. So one more question. Maybe this is also a little bit of a gotcha. I know I promised no gotcha questions, but I'm just kind of testing the ice just a little bit here. If either of you were to advise young kids today, maybe they're aware, they're becoming increasingly aware of, the issues. They watch TV, they were on Instagram and Pinterest and TikTok and all these other social sites, and they know things are happening. But for them to start to get involved in their communities, starting local, where are some outlets that you would recommend to them to go to at least begin to get involved, to take that first baby step?
So I think that identify something you want to solve, right? So don't just get involved in a movement because someone is involved or because they've got a cool Instagram, because that's just not going to carry you through. You've really got to care. Activism's hard. So you better have a basic underlying passion. But I don't care what that is. Once you find the thing that needs you, and it could be getting a stop sign on the end of your block. It doesn't need to be any more ambitious than that. But identify something you think is wrong in the world. Identify the way that you think you have skills to help. And then call them up, write them a letter, follow them on social media, because they need you. They absolutely need you. And whether you're stuffing envelopes or giving speeches or raising money or whatever, there's a role for you regardless of your skills. But you better care, because there's not going to be people handing you a gold medal for helping. So it better be its own reward, because you want to see that change in the world.
Fair enough. Lucinda?
I guess I would add to that, as well as being ambitious, be practical in whatever it is you're doing. And I think one of the things I often think about that would be useful today is, a lot of times, especially if you're young, there's an instinct to say that we need to do something because it's morally right. And of course, that's true. But sometimes it can be more effective to explain to people what's in it for them. This is the reason why you should be behind this cause, not just because it's the right thing to do, but this is the practical good that's going to come into your life because of it. And that was one of the things that happened in the suffrage movement when it really goes mainstream, up to that point when Susan B. Anthony is giving anywhere from 75 to 100 speeches a year for 40 years. And she's talking about women having the right to vote. When you had club women talking about how women needed the right to vote because they would be able to do things that were good for their families, they were particularly talking about a whole host of progressive era legislation, including temperance work, that was considered very respectable. But they talked about it as the home protection ballot. And that helped it make sense for people to say, oh, yes, this is why it should be good for women to vote, because they're going to vote for things that are very important to us. Now, the interesting thing is that women, I don't think necessarily do always vote in one particular way. And after women got the vote in 1920, they found that the world did not change overnight. But you do see people starting to have an impact. And in fact, with this election, you now have more women in Congress than have ever existed. It's not just the fact that we have a woman elect for vice president. It's that you have more women in Congress than have ever existed before. And there's still a long way to go. But a lot of it, I think, does come down to how do you get people on board for whether it's something local that you want to do. Becca talked about, the stop sign on the end of your street, or if it's climate change, letting people know what is the benefit, what is the good that's going to come out of this.
Fair enough. Rebecca and Lucinda, in the time we have left, we often end our show, and I think we've probably just interspersed a lot of what I call insights to go. But we have this at the end of our show. And any other final thoughts, insights that you both would like to share with our audience?
So I have one that I actually completely stole from Lucinda, which is that these women are not perfect, right? It is tempting when you write women's history to overstate their attributes and downplay their flaws in order to justify the inclusion of these women in the American history canon. But first of all, that's bad history, but also it's really boring. Saints are boring, right? So it is important to recognize these women's flaws, not just to get your history right, but also sometimes you learn by counterexample, right? You need to know what they did wrong in order to not make them the same mistakes. But also the fact that these women were flawed and imperfect is liberating, right? It means that all of us who are also deeply flawed and imperfect can also change the world. And so let's not pretend they were saints. Let's recognize them, warts and all, and then go forward with all your own warts and do your own thing.
I love that. Becca always gives me credit. She's so good to do that, but she says it better than I do. And these are very real women. I mean, I have to admit right now, I do think a lot about Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who had 7 children. In fact, her last child she had when she was 43 and weighed 12 pounds. Having been a mother, I know, I'm like, and there are times And she and Susan B. Anthony were friends for over 50 years. So Beck and I, we're coming up on that. But it was hard. It was difficult. And there are times that she writes Susan and she's like, how am I supposed to do this? Because right now I've got to get the kids fed and make sure. And she literally says that she has to get shoes on their feet. And she has to take them to the dentist and find somebody to tutor the kids. And I think that sounds like any mommy blogger posting today. You never read about Thomas Jefferson having to worry about this kind of stuff when he's off to writing his Declaration of Independence. What's he doing with childcare? But these are very real human people, and they helped each other out. They built these alliances, they built these friendships, they built these institutions that sustained them through pretty tough times. And and I guess that's sort of what I would add to what Becca says. Never give up. In fact, Susan B. Anthony's last words, public words, were "failure is impossible," and I think that's true. You just have to be ready to keep going. And there will absolutely be times when it just looks so difficult and so exhausting and so futile. And that's normal. You can survive it. Just don't give up.
Fantastic. And on that note, Rebecca, Lucinda, it's been an absolute pleasure to have you both on the Success Insight podcast, and just, talking and sharing not only your love of just the study of the suffragist movement, but also the insights from being so actively and intimately involved in, the politics in this country and of your families and the journalism. And it's just like, as I had kind of jokingly shared early on, it's like I feel like I'm talking to the kids of royalty in a way. So, but just a wonderful book, and really I want to thank you both for taking the time out of your busy days. And you have the kids and COVID and all the other requirements and necessities in your lives to come on and share this great story and really this wonderful book, The Suffragist Playbook. So thank you both.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Now I'm going to go remind my little princess and princes that they've got to clean up the kitchen.
There you go, Mom. Go get them. All right, folks, we have just been chatting with Rebecca Boggs Roberts and Lucinda Robb. And again, with the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment, and really with the election in the U.S. nearly 2 weeks ago of our first female and woman of color Vice President-elect Kamala Harris, The Suffragist Playbook, Your Guide to Changing the World. This was published this past October by Candlewick Press. Really, it's just a fitting event, this book, alongside really what is going to be long remembered as an historic election and a wonderful day for women, and of all those wonderful activists, Susan B. Anthony, Katie Stanton, Clara Colby, etc., who over many years and generations took those baby steps, one right after the other, in the struggle for women's suffrage and the right to vote. So this is a wonderful book for kids, and do go out to Amazon. We'll certainly provide the links to the book. So if there are teens, young adults, this is the perfect book for them. And really, it's a great first step to help them get involved in the community. And as Rebecca and Lucinda have shared, start small. Work on something that you care about, not something that that your friends are doing, your family's telling you to do. Find something that you care about and take that first step. And it's going to be a rewarding change in your life. And just think about the people that you're going to be meeting along the way on that journey, and also your ability to really make a difference in your own right. Folks, if you would like to listen to this podcast, do visit us on successinsightpodcast.com. You can visit us on Facebook and LinkedIn, our Success Insight podcast pages. The podcast will also be available on the major podcasting platforms: Google Podcast, Apple Podcast, iHeartRadio, Spotify, Pandora, and Amazon Music. And we're also on YouTube. So, folks, wherever you are, whatever you're doing, go out there, have a phenomenal day. Continue to practice social distancing, wear that mask, take care of yourselves and your family, and we'll see you on the next episode of the Success Insight Podcast. Take care now.
Success Insight is a production of Fox Coaching and First Story Strategies. Find us online, successinsightpodcast.com.